A haunting tale of IKEA. It was a typical Saturday afternoon when Sarah and Mark decided to visit IKEA. The couple had recently moved into a new apartment and needed furniture. They had heard stories about the store's vastness, but they were unprepared for what lay ahead. As they entered the sprawling warehouse, the scent of fresh wood and cinnamon greeted them. Brightly lit showrooms sprawled in every direction, filled with stylish furniture and decor ideas. Mark grabbed a cart, and they began their adventure, excited to explore the endless aisles. Hours passed as they wandered through the maze of displays. They laughed at the quirky names of products and playfully debated over which couch would look best. In their living room, time slipped away, and soon they realized they had lost track of their original intent. The store was enormous, and every corner looked similar to the last. "Let's check out the kitchen section again," Sarah suggested, glancing at her phone. "I think we passed it a while back." Mark nodded, but as they turned to retrace their steps, they found themselves in a different part of the store. The layout had changed, or perhaps they had simply lost their bearings. The cheerful atmosphere began to shift as they noticed fewer shoppers around them. "Where is everyone?" Mark asked, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "Maybe they're all in the checkout line," Sarah replied, though she felt an unsettling chill creeping up her spine. They continued walking, but the aisles seemed to stretch on endlessly. The cheerful music that had been playing overhead faded into silence, replaced by an eerie stillness. Sarah shivered, clutching her shopping list tightly. "Let's find an employee," Mark suggested, trying to maintain a sense of calm. They approached a nearby display labeled Living Room Inspiration, but there was no one in sight. The absence of staff was disconcerting. They wandered deeper into the store, calling out for help, but their voices echoed back to them, swallowed by the vastness. As they turned a corner, Sarah spotted a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision. She glanced back but saw nothing, just rows of furniture staring back at them like silent sentinels. "Did you see that?" she asked, her heart racing. Mark shrugged, trying to dismiss her concern. "It's probably just our imagination." But as they continued to navigate the maze, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Shadows danced at the edges of her vision, and every now and then, she thought she heard faint whispers echoing through the aisles. After what felt like hours of wandering, they stumbled upon a small cough tucked away in a corner. The bright lights inside were inviting, and they hoped to find someone who could help them. But when they entered, the cough was empty. No baristas, no customers, just abandoned tables and chairs. "This is getting really strange," Mark said, his voice low. "We should keep moving." They left the cough and ventured further into the store. The atmosphere grew heavier. The air felt thick with an unexplainable tension. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. Suddenly, they heard a loud crash from somewhere deep within the store, a sound that shattered the silence and sent chills down their spines. "What was that?" Sarah gasped. "I don't know," Mark replied, his eyes wide with fear. "Let's go check it out." Against their better judgment, they followed the sound through a narrow aisle lined with kitchen cabinets. As they turned another corner, they found themselves in a dimly lit section filled with dark wood furniture that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Hello," Mark called out hesitantly. "Is anyone there?" No response came except for the echo of their own voices. They exchanged nervous glances and decided it was time to leave this section behind. As they turned to retrace their steps, they realized something terrifying. The path behind them had changed. The familiar aisles were now replaced with unfamiliar displays, different furniture arrangements. That made no sense. "Sarah, I think we're lost," Mark said quietly. Panic set in as they hurriedly walked through what felt like an endless loop of identical rooms. Each turn led them deeper into a labyrinth that seemed designed to confuse and disorient them. "Mark, look!" Sarah shouted suddenly, pointing ahead. In the distance, stood a figure tall and shadowy against the backdrop of a brightly lit display. It was hard to make out any details, but there was something distinctly wrong about it. "Is that an employee?" Mark asked, squinting to see better. "Maybe let's go," Sarah urged, feeling a mix of hope and dread. They rushed towards the figure, but as they got closer, it melted away into thin air, leaving nothing but an empty space where it had stood moments before. "Did you see that?" Mark exclaimed, his breath quickening. "Yes, it just disappeared," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. The silence returned, heavier than before. They stood frozen for a moment before deciding to keep moving. Every step felt like an eternity as they navigated through the increasingly claustrophobic aisles. Then came another sound, a soft thud followed by faint whispering that seemed to echo all around them. They couldn't make out any words, but it felt like a warning. "Let's get out of here," Sarah said urgently. They picked up their pace, trying to find any sign of an exit or even another person. But every turn led them deeper into the maze. The shadows grew longer and darker as the overhead lights flickered ominously. Suddenly, Mark stopped dead in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Sarah strained her ears and caught it, a low growl emanating from somewhere close by. "Run!" Mark shouted as fear took over. They sprinted down the aisle, heart pounding in sync with their hurried footsteps. The growl morphed into a series of guttural sounds that echoed behind them, growing louder and more menacing with each passing second. As they turned another corner, Sarah caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, something large and predatory. Panic surged through her veins as she grasped Mark's arm tighter. "Over there," she pointed towards an exit sign glowing dimly in the distance. They dashed toward it, adrenaline fueling their escape. But just as they reached the doorway leading to what they hoped was freedom, it slammed shut before their eyes with a deafening bang. "No, no, no," Sarah screamed, pounding on the door in desperation. Mark pulled her back just as the growling noise intensified behind them. They turned to face whatever was lurking in the darkness. From the shadows emerged a figure tall and grotesque with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to absorb all light around it. It stood motionless for a moment before letting out a bone-chilling screech that reverberated through the air like nails on a chalkboard. "We need to hide," Mark shouted desperately. They darted into a nearby display of cabinets and crouched down low, hearts racing as they tried to control their breathing. The screeching subsided momentarily. They could hear heavy footsteps approaching, peering through a crack in the cabinet door. Sarah watched in horror as the creature prowled closer, its elongated fingers dragging along the floor as if searching for prey. It paused near their hiding spot, sniffing the air like a predator hunting its next meal. "Stay quiet," Mark whispered fiercely. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give them away. The creature lingered for what felt like an eternity before finally moving on, its footsteps fading into the distance. They waited in silence until they could no longer hear its presence. "What do we do now?" Sarah whispered, fear evident in her voice. "We have to find another way out," Mark replied resolutely. "We can't stay here." Cautiously, they emerged from their hiding place and peered around cautiously. The aisles were still eerily quiet, however. They both knew that whatever hunted them was still lurking nearby. They moved slowly through the labyrinthine layout of IKEA, careful not to make any noise as they searched for an exit or any sign of life. But every aisle seemed to lead them deeper into darkness rather than towards safety. With each passing moment, despair settled heavily upon them. This place was not just a store, it was alive with something sinister, something that thrived on fear and confusion. As they rounded yet another corner, they stumbled upon what appeared to be an employee break room, dimly lit, with flickering fluorescent lights overhead. Mark cautiously pushed open the door. It creaked ominously on its hinges. Inside lay remnants of half-eaten meals and scattered papers, a stark contrast. to the pristine displays outside. But there were no employees present, only an unsettling silence filled the room. "What if we can find a phone or something?" Sarah suggested hopefully. Mark nodded and began rummaging through drawers, while Sarah searched for any signs of communication devices. But just as hope began to rise within them again, a loud crash echoed from outside, the unmistakable sound of furniture being overturned, followed by frantic footsteps approaching rapidly. "Hide!" Mark hissed as he shoved Sarah behind a table just as the door burst open. The creature entered, the same grotesque figure that had stalked them moments before, its eyes scanning hungrily for its prey. It sniffed the air again, its long fingers brushed against various objects scattered throughout the break room before moving closer toward where Sarah and Mark were hiding. Fear gripped them both as they held their breath. Time seemed to stretch infinitely as they waited for it to discover them. Suddenly, there was a loud banging noise from somewhere else in the store, a distraction that momentarily drew the creature's attention away from them. Seizing this opportunity, Mark motioned for Sarah to follow him quietly as he slipped out from behind the table. They crept towards another exit door at the far end of the break room, hoping against hope that it would lead them back into safety. But just as they reached for the handle, another loud crash reverberated through IKEA, the sound echoing ominously through every aisle around them. And then came an unsettling realization: they weren't alone anymore, as more shadows emerged from various corners of the store, each one resembling that same grotesque figure. They understood too late that this place had become their prison, a never-ending nightmare where escape was merely an illusion. And somewhere deep within those endless aisles filled with furniture and despair lay secrets best left undisturbed, a haunting presence waiting patiently for its next victims as darkness enveloped them once more. Lost in the maze, the final confrontation, panic surged through Sarah and Mark as they stood frozen in front of the exit door. The shadows continued to writhe and shift around them, the air thick with the scent of fear. The grotesque figures, now more than just a singular entity, seemed to close in, their hollow eyes glinting with a predatory hunger. "Mark, we can't stay here," Sarah whispered urgently, her voice barely above a breath. He nodded, his mind racing for a plan. "We need to distract them," he said, glancing around the break room for anything they could use. His eyes landed on a metal trash can. "If I throw this, it might create enough noise to draw them away." "Do it," Sarah urged, her heart pounding in her chest. With a swift motion, Mark grabbed the trash can and hurled it across the room. It clattered loudly against the wall, the sound reverberating through the break room and into the aisles beyond. The grotesque figures turned simultaneously, their attention drawn to the noise. Seizing the moment, Sarah and Mark pushed through the exit door and into a narrow corridor that led deeper into the maze of IKEA. They ran, adrenaline fueling their every step as they navigated through dimly lit passageways filled with towering shelves of furniture. Every corner they turned felt like a gamble. They had no idea what awaited them in the darkness. "Where do we go?" Sarah gasped, breathless from their frantic escape. "Just keep moving," Mark replied, determination etched on his face. "We have to find a way out." As they sprinted down another aisle, they spotted a flickering emergency exit sign in the distance. Hope surged within them, but just as they approached, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind them, heavy and relentless. "They're coming," Mark shouted, urging Sarah to pick up her pace. They reached the exit door, but it was locked tight. Panic clawed at Sarah's throat as she rattled the handle desperately. "It won't budge. Look for another way," Mark urged, scanning their surroundings. To their left, an open display led to a set of stairs that spiraled upward. "There. We can go up," he pointed. Without hesitation, they dashed toward the staircase, taking 2 steps at a time as they ascended into the unknown. The footsteps grew fainter behind them, but they knew it wouldn't be long before the creatures found their trail again. At the top of the stairs, they emerged into a dimly lit storage area filled with boxes and furniture stacked haphazardly. The atmosphere felt oppressive. Shadows loomed large against the walls, and the air was thick with dust. "Do you think we can hide here?" Sarah whispered, glancing around nervously. Mark nodded, but kept his voice low. "Let's find a place to conceal ourselves until we can figure out our next move." They ducked behind a stack of flat-packed furniture and held their breath, listening intently for any signs of pursuit. The silence was deafening until they heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching once more. Sarah's heart raced as she peered cautiously from behind their hiding spot. She could see one of the grotesque figures moving through the storage area, its head tilting unnaturally as if sniffing the air for their scent. "It's getting closer," she murmured, fear creeping into her voice. Mark clenched his fists, determination surging within him. "We can't let them corner us. We need to make a break for it." Just then, the creature paused, its hollow eyes locking onto Sarah's hiding place. It let out a low growl that sent shivers down her spine. "Now!" Mark shouted suddenly. They bolted from their hiding spot and sprinted toward another exit. At the far end of the storage area, the creature lunged after them, its elongated limbs reaching out in an attempt to grab them. They burst through another door and found themselves in a narrow hallway lined with emergency exits. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as they raced toward the nearest door. "Keep going," Mark urged as he yanked open the door and pushed Sarah through ahead of him. They stumbled into a dimly lit corridor that felt different from the rest of the store. This place was empty and silent, devoid of any furniture or displays. "Is this an exit?" Sarah panted, looking around frantically. Mark squinted at a sign hanging on the wall that read "Emergency Exit." "I think so. We just need to find our way to the end." As they hurried down the corridor, they could hear the growls growing louder behind them. The creatures were relentless in their pursuit. "Faster," Mark urged as they neared another door at the end of the hallway. With one final push, they reached it and flung it open, spilling out into an open parking lot bathed in moonlight. Fresh air washed over them like a wave of relief. But before they could celebrate their escape, they turned back to see shadows spilling out of the doorway. Behind them, more figures emerging from within IKEA, their hollow eyes glinting in the darkness. "We have to run," Sarah screamed as they sprinted toward their car parked at the far end of the lot. They fumbled with the keys as they reached the vehicle, hands shaking with fear and adrenaline. Mark finally managed to unlock the door, and they jumped inside just as one of the creatures lunged toward them. "Go! Go!" Sarah shouted as Mark started the engine and slammed on the gas. The tires screeched against the asphalt as they sped away from IKEA, leaving behind the nightmare that had consumed them for what felt like an eternity. As they drove into the night, Sarah glanced back at the store receding in the distance. The bright blue letters of IKEA flickered ominously under the moonlight, casting eerie shadows across the parking lot. "We made it," Mark said breathlessly, though his voice trembled with lingering fear. "But what was that place?" Sarah asked, shaking her head in disbelief. "It felt alive, like it was trying to trap us." "I don't know," Mark replied, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "But we're never going back there again." As they drove further away from that haunting maze of furniture and shadows, a sense of relief washed over them, but deep down, both knew that some places hold secrets best left undiscovered, secrets that could haunt them long after they escaped. And somewhere within those endless aisles, filled with furniture and despair, lay whispers of darkness, waiting patiently for its next unsuspecting victims.